Jennifer Nelson here, host of the Pocket Hours podcast. Here at Pocket Hours, I get to interview fabulous individuals in our industry to help educate us all and to up our game. We get to hear from them, their secret sauce, how they are successful to hopefully help inspire us to do better work. The cool part is, as you listen to these interviews, you can also get clock hours on the go. So you listen to a podcast and then you email us at info@scoutrealestate.com to learn more about obtaining those hours. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in, and let's have some fun learning how to be better at what we do. Oh my goodness, we've got a good one today. It's juicy, it's interesting, it'll make you angry, you might cry a little. I don't know. This is going to be fun. Jennifer Hohnstein from Williams Kastner is on the show today. She is a landlord-tenant attorney, and boy, if you thought it was bad, you're going to think it's even worse by the time you finish this show. I don't say that in jest at all. I actually say we have got to become more educated as a community of realtors about all of the changes that are happening for landlord-tenant and how incredibly tenant-friendly our state is. So if you have a client that is looking to become a landlord, if you know clients that are landlords, if you are a landlord, it's very good to listen to this show and learn all that you need to know about taking that on. Here we go. By popular demand, we are having another guest on who is going to be talking with us about some of the tenant landlord issues that are ever present in our state. So, Jennifer Hohnstein, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Just a little background for those of you that may not have heard the last episode that we did last year with a colleague actually of Jennifer's. We were speaking about some of the things that I think a lot of people that are interested in getting into becoming a landlord don't know about the laws that are very tenant friendly, we'll say, and we'll get into that just in a minute, in Seattle. So let's picture this person who says, hey, instead of investing in the stock market, we're going to invest more in real estate, and we want to buy our first rental property. And so, realtors, as you listen to this podcast, I would really, really invite you to send this to them, to have them listen to it, because we're going to be covering some things that they really need to consider before jumping in. So, Jennifer, if you would maybe just think of the top things that come off the top of your head, and we're going to dive into some of them as we keep talking. But if you were talking to a person who says, I'm interested in becoming a landlord, what might you say to them to sort of help them be clear about what they're stepping into?
So the first question I'd always ask is why? Historically, so many, and especially mom and pop landlords, would go into it because this is a way to help somebody, to work long term with a family, to be able to pick a tenant or a family who you could have a long-term relationship with, grow. And perhaps they didn't have the best credit. Perhaps they didn't have their traditional history that would enter them into, say, a beautiful house like the one you're wanting to provide. You would be able to select somebody after talking to them and make sure that you could have this great relationship, and sort of combine your wealth of experience with, making some good money and helping somebody else out. Nowadays, please, please, please do not do that. And I apologize. A lot of what I'm going to sound is very gloom and doom. I never want to say that people should not do something. But nowadays, people really need to understand that there's so many more risks than ever before. And if you're not actually treating any rental as a business, as well as understanding the risk associated with the business, you should not be going into this area at this time, unfortunately. Unfortunately, what I see the most of is extremely well-intentioned people. A lot of times, people with backgrounds in social work, people who have worked for the state or the city, who really believe that they are going into this area to keep rents low and really try to make a difference. Right now, there are such incredible tenant favorable protections that so many times when I see mom and pop landlords and I look at so many of the truly kind, generous things they have done, they're inadvertently hurting themselves.
Gotcha.
So the number one question is why? And the second one is, can you really treat it as a business? Do you have the resources? There's so many areas now that you do need to tag in for people with more support. Ideally, if you can hire a property manager, I would encourage you to do so. I would also encourage you to spend the money, sit down with a landlord-tenant attorney and spend an hour and actually talk to them realistically about all the steps that now takes all of the hoops that you're going to jump through, because once you have a tenant, especially in the city of Seattle, the presumption is the tenant is there in perpetuity until the tenant wants to move. And so you're going to be having some very, very strong presumptions that are not in your favor, unfortunately, if you have somebody who is not willing to work with you or abide by the conditions of the rental agreement.
Yeah, that's great. I was just taking a bunch of notes, and hopefully, those of you that are listening will do the same. I think you're going to find yourself with lots of pages of notes as we keep talking. But I love what you said, treat it as a business. I do think there are folks, at least in my database over the last 23 years I've been doing real estate, that do want to make a difference in affordable housing in our city because it's a scarcity, right? And so they do walk in with sort of this Pollyanna way, and they end up several hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt at the end of the process, not realizing that their sort of way to walk in with good intentions is end up without the information ahead of time. I also love what you said about resources. And, we say this all the time to our clients, but having the ability to take on the mortgage yourself without the rental income, I can't emphasize that enough. And I know you will also be saying that over and over again, Jennifer, in this talk. But if you are unable to pay that mortgage on your own without the tenant income, I would advise you to not buy a rental property. Because if you get in the situation I was in last year with a tenant that stopped paying and stayed in the home for several months, you will lose your house and then the investment that you have in your house. And talk about a punch in the gut to end up with trying to do something good and good intentions and ending up losing your nest egg that was going to be your retirement because you have someone squat in your house. Um, I think it's also interesting. I want you to speak more to this. It's what you said is so profound, and I just want everyone. I just want to like make big, whatever about this. But we're going to get into the tenant protections. But in Washington State, a tenant can stay in their tenancy as long as they want to. In your mind, if those listeners, and for me too, before I went through this process last year, I was like, "What do you mean? I own this house. They've stayed here for 3 years, but now I've decided I want to rent it to someone else, or I don't really like this tenant," or you name the options that you can think of that you want to make a change. But in Washington State, Jennifer, I'd love you to speak to that isn't your option anymore.
No, and there's some very limited exceptions, so I never want to make a rule to everything. But for example, City of Seattle, you have a one-term lease and you write into this lease. This is a fixed term lease for 1 year, right? And you think you're set. You think you're good to go. In the City of Seattle, you need something called just cause not to renew that lease. And so you can't simply say, I've decided that this isn't economically feasible. I've decided that at this point, I'm simply going to be taking a break or something like that. You need a reason that the city of Seattle, as well as, of course, the Washington state, approves of for being able to terminate the tenancy. Unfortunately, there's this default that, especially if an agreement's in month to month, anytime you enter into a landlord tenant relationship, there is a default presumption that until the tenant decides to leave or you have a court order terminating the tenancy, that landlord tenant relationship is going to continue.
Let's give an example. My sister's moving in from another state. I own a rental property. It would be great for her to live in that and pay me rent. I currently have a tenant there. Would I be able to give notice to that tenant to say, we'd like you to be gone by 90 days and my sister's going to be moving into the house?
I would have to double check the timelines. I think you can. I believe it's 120 days. And I always double check and triple check every timeline. And I know this sounds ridiculous because it's my field, but there's
They're
always
changing all the time.
little changes that are always coming into play, as well as it really can depend area by area. But yes, you can have just cause if you are going to have a family member move in. However, this is going to startle some people, but you have to provide enough information where the tenant believes you. I don't think you're really going to move in. I think that, this daughter doesn't exist. So they can take you to court and have publicly appointed attorneys prolong it. Make sure you have enough proof that indeed your daughter exists. She really does want to move in, all of these things. And it can be a very prolonged, intensive experience.
Oh,
So
man.
even when you want to terminate the tenancy because you or a family member want to move in, again, it's not an immediate process. And especially for a savvy tenant that just doesn't want to leave, it can be extremely prolonged process.
we're going to do a little bit of scaring today, not because that's our goal, but because it truly can become a nightmare. I lived it. So, in the meantime, this person can literally stop paying you, have possession of your home, and be working the system, which is exactly what happened in my case, to the tune of a loss of about $30,000 for me that year. So by the time she was out, that was the loss that I had incurred. And that's actually getting out pretty easy from what I've heard. So they have these rights that extend into your property that are outlandish. I can't say it any differently that I really think that we've got it all wrong here in Seattle when it comes to, we want to protect a tenant, of course, when it comes to that. But I think the pendulum has swung insanely to the other side. Let's say you want to sell your property. It's the spring market. It's going great for homes in the area that you own. You've got a tenant in there and they're about midway through their year lease. And you say, okay, I'm going to give them notice and have them go. Can you do that?
No. That was easy. There are some limited exceptions when you can sell a property and actually evict the tenant. But for the most part, that tenant's going with the property. Basically, whoever purchases that property is going to purchase the property with the tenant in place and according to whatever lease and rental arrangements are currently in place.
So then let's say I learn that no one wants the property with a tenant in it. So I wait then, and how much notice do I have to give that tenant in order to have them literally out of the property for me to be able to sell it?
It depends.
Okay.
You can only have notice of intent to sell for certain tenancies. And I can double check, of course, all the nuts and bolts. But for the most part, to terminate a tenancy, you need just cause. And so the big easy ones is failure to pay rent or failure to comply with the terms of the rental agreement. A lot of times people think of termination of tenancies as these big, easy matters. Or, for example, the police have been called. That would be a 3-day notice to terminate a tenancy for the most part. But even with those, it's not easy. And especially when you don't have public enemy extraordinaire, you have public annoyance extraordinaire. He keeps hotboxing his neighbor with the skankiest pot around at 2 a.m. and driving out, the neighboring tenants every every time, one after another. It is extremely hard to terminate tenancies of people who are engaging in long-term, low-level harassing behavior. It is one of the extreme blind areas in the state of Washington. So you're going to have to start digging and you're going to start to try to find, how do I terminate the tenancy within Washington state rules, and especially if you're in the city of Seattle or city of Tacoma, within the local city, county, state legislation.
Wow. Okay. So I thought that if they're in a year lease and 90 days before the end of that year lease, before that term is up, not in the middle of it, but at the end of it. So you can't, like, let's say spring market's great, too bad for you. They still have 6 more months in their lease. But within 90 days of the end of their lease, if you give them notice to say, I'm selling the property, you can then have them leave and sell the property. My understanding is that true?
I'm going to actually start pulling the statute.
Okay, great. Because what I understood is that the tenant can then come back and make sure that you've actually sold the property. And if you haven't, they can have a case against you, because landlords would use this to get people out. Hey, we're going to sell the house, so you got to go. But then if you don't sell it, they have quite a case in the state of Washington, I think, to say that's why we moved. But my
Okay.
understanding was 90 days.
It's 90 days. And I want to actually bring a few different rules together. There are certain times where it's the first lease and it's and it is before the termination of the first lease, at least 60 days out. There are some situations where you can issue a notice of non-renewal without just cause. So you do have a limited exception in some areas, not Seattle, not unincorporated King County, but in some areas, you do have the 60 to 90 days out, the notice of non-renewal. So that's one resource you have. With regards to the section that you are talking about, it is when the tenant continues in possession after the owner elects to sell a single family residence and the landlord has provided at least 90 days advance written notice. And so, single family residence. Let's talk about what types of residence you may or may not be. It's a lot more narrow of an exception than you would believe. Like, for example, are you selling a triplex, a duplex? you are selling that duplex, that triplex with the tenants in place, most likely. Yes, there's a small exception for 90 days out for those single family residences. But even if you are attempting to sell it, again, the tenant can say, I don't really believe you. This is a ruse. You don't like me. Um, it's because of my weed habit, and I've been hotboxing my neighbor at 2 in the morning. You know, like it can be something like that. And you have to say that indeed, no, I intend to sell it. Here's the marketing. Here's the steps I've taken. You have to provide enough specificity, as well as if you don't actually sell it or go through with the sale after a certain time, there's presumptions that can go into place that indeed you weren't actually intending to sell it and you are now guilty of wrongful termination. And the tenant will have a lot of very strong legal recourses against you. So please do not say, I am going to move a family member in. I am going to sell my single, family unit. If you don't really mean it and you're not going to take every single step to truly try to sell it or have that family member move in.
Part of what the objective is today in having Jennifer on the show and talking about the same topic again is to say what you're walking into is a lot of laws that came into place sort of during COVID, maybe pre-COVID. The intention was to protect a tenant from being kicked out unlawfully, right? To having landlords overstep and do things they shouldn't do. What I think has happened, though, is that it has now been so tenant friendly and so difficult for landlords that people are pulling out of homes. They're selling their homes in King County specifically and buying in other counties to try to say, we literally don't feel like as landlords, we have any rights anymore to do with what we want with our properties. And again, not that I'm saying tenants shouldn't have rights because I think they should, but if I want to sell my house when I want to sell my house, I feel like I should be able to say, here's plenty of notice. You need to find other accommodations, and I'm going to sell this house. When in reality, that is not that simple. None of this is a straightforward, simple procedure. It seems like all of it leaves room for a tenant to just sort of say, sorry, no, we're staying here.
It's even worse than it initially sounds. Please understand, did public defense up in Alaska for 8 years. I have a strong belief in protecting people. There's now this amazing presumption, this belief that by keeping people in tenancies for prolonged situations, you are protecting them as well as protecting them from homelessness. You are actually protecting their rights, and something that I truly disagree with. When I worked in Alaska, for example, I worked in public defense with a lot of quasi civil matters. And it really was about what is a long term solution to the problem. And typically, quasi civil cases, without going into too much depth, the immediate push is ripping the band aid off and trying to figure out, is there a problem such that the state should be involved? Like, why are we here? What is the reason behind this? And so, for example, a lot of times people who are not paying rent, did they lose their job? Is this a one time unemployment situation? Is there medical? And there can be a lot of heartbreaking reasons, and especially in this market economy, why people cannot pay their rent. So, in traditional quasi civil cases, what you would do is you'd say, okay, we are going to quickly decide whether or not there's a problem. And so, again, not to minimize the situation, but this really isn't the evidentiary burden of the century. This isn't Sherlock Holmes. This is, here's the ledger. Have they paid? Have they not? Right? But instead, we go through these prolonged court cases where the whole emphasis is, did they receive the right notice at the right time, with the right type of mailing, with the exact right dates? Did somebody knock first and try to hand it to them before putting in the mail or posting and mailing appropriately? That is the level of detail that they want, as opposed to, is there a problem and how do we solve it? And so right now, all of the resources are going into basically prolonging the problem. There is no emphasis whatsoever on fixing the problem, finding the root cause, or actually providing timely and effective resources to people, some of which are in crisis and could use the help. So that is the current model. And I say this as an attorney, that people truly believe litigation is the solution and more lawyers and more prolonged court cases solve things. And let me tell you, it does not. Like, what type of lawyers decide that litigation solves problems? It does not solve problems. Social workers, access to resources, understanding the root causes of the issues, That's what solves problems. And that's what actually has long-term sustainable solutions. But that's not where we are.
Oh my
So
gosh, I just want to do like a cheers and like a hug you and like a can we make that a TED talk? I mean, the things you just said are so true. And I found that true in my situation, but I will say this as a word to the wise, everything Jennifer just said, thank you for saying it. But also it feels as if time is definitely not on your side in any way in these circumstances. And what can become this tiny little loophole, you just spoke of it. Oh, well, I'm sorry, you didn't knock 3 times on their door, and therefore you have to reserve them. And now they're going to avoid being served. And the list goes on about the loopholes that enable these tenants to continue to live for free in your home while you're paying a huge attorney bill, not to mention not hopefully, but maybe not paying the mortgage on it. So, yes, I wish that instead of finding loopholes for all these things, we could be saying, gosh, this person, whoever it is that's staying with you, needs another place to live. What options do they have? Instead of taking advantage of a system and having people lose their homes that are trying to provide affordable housing. So, yeah. I remember a couple of the things too, and I'd love for you to speak to that, is to say, I remember one of the rules was if they have a kid, a school age kid, you can't evict them until school's out. I mean, what? A tenant that works for the state or works for a school, like an adult that has a job at a school, you cannot evict them until the school year is out. Again, I think the intent here is to say, let's try to not have people, unhoused. But we have swung so far to now you have to wait 9 months because your tenant stopped paying in October to actually have them move out in June when school's out. And too bad for you that those 9 months you're not going to get paid at all.
it's actually a bit worse. And I'm not going to go into details because I never want to inadvertently train anyone how to game the system. And I don't want to give too many tips and tricks of things we've seen. But if they've only stopped paying in October, you're actually maybe lucky that there's unfortunately some very savvy tenants out there right now. We have to double check it's actually their kid. We have suddenly people showing up with kids in court, and the property manager is saying, I have never seen them with a kid the whole time. You know,
Wow.
we have
Wow.
just some wild cases where, again, if people can get long-term housing without having to pay for it, there's unfortunately a lot of creativity and workarounds with there's a group of people who very much know how to game the system, and the rules are disproportionately favoring that very small group as opposed to actually applying resources for the people who are in crisis, and we could actually provide some timely long-term solution and help. Like it doesn't make sense the way the system is currently organized.
I remember in the last interview, Caitlin had mentioned something about, we won't use names. In fact, she didn't either. I don't know who this person is, but it was someone who worked for the housing department, was an employee of the housing department in our state, and had lived for 2 years free because she stopped paying. So you have a problem, right? When the people that have the information are then taking it and using it to their own advantage, and that poor landlord had a real fight and was still ongoing when we last spoke. I want to talk for a minute. I joined, per Caitlin's advice, last year during my debacle, the Washington Landlord Association. Would highly recommend anyone who is interested in becoming a landlord after this show. I don't know if you will be, but if you still want to do this, join that association, because that association has up-to-date forms and notices and everything at your fingertips. It's like $120 a year. And you're getting language from attorneys that are currently doing these kinds of court hearings around this stuff. And so, you can find all this stuff for free online, but I would say the language on it is probably outdated because it changes so frequently. Pocket Hours is brought to you by Scout Real Estate. Hi, I'm Jennifer Nelson, owner at Scout Real Estate. I started this firm with the vision of doing things differently, with our focus on legendary service for our clients and creating a community of producing agents to spur each other to do higher quality work. If you are interested in learning more about how a small group of like-minded brokers have come together to have some fun while doing a lot of business, reach out to me, 206-227-7966, or email jennifer@scoutrealestate.com. I promise you this, fun is a high priority for me, but so is winning. So if you appreciate those two things, you might be interested in Scout. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Here's an explanation that I think probably will really hit home for a lot of people. Right now, tenants have a right to counsel. And so, traditionally, in quasi civil matters, such as consumer protection section of the Attorney General, the attorneys have obligations to every single person in the state of Washington. And so, when they pick a case, they actually have to look and say, I don't represent you individually, I represent every single person in the state of Washington. Is this a case that actually reflects Washington's needs? As well as with many other quasi civil matters, if one side is appointed attorney, the other side is as well. And so those are the traditional ways that this works. Here, the tenant is appointed attorney with all of the emphasis, all of the zealous advocacy only on that tenant. Take criminal cases, for example. If you're representing a criminal defendant, you have a duty of zealous advocacy, and let's say there's 3 other co-defendants, and your client whispers to you, I want to throw everyone else under the bus, and one of them's my grandmother, because I will get a better resolution. You have a duty to actually throw every other co-defendant under the bus, because your duty is to your one client. So think about that in terms of how the duties of zealous advocacy come into tenants' rights. That under the RLTA, a tenant is every single person in that building who has a rental agreement. It is every single person, who should be having protections under the RLTA. However, the way it's currently interpreted is that the people who are the ones who are breaking the rental agreements, who in many cases are in crisis, who are in the worst situations of their lives, they're the ones who are driving the show with the free legal advice, who are making laws deliberately designed for people in the worst type of situations with a very, very, very narrow scope of their tenancy. And so we oftentimes hear arguments where I'm like, that may be good for like those 3-week windows for that one person. But as soon as they're out of this case, they actually wouldn't want that done. That makes no sense.
Yeah,
But
I
we
got
have
it.
this huge emphasis on these short-term, shall we say, extremely one-tenant friendly, solutions that harm every single landlord, as well as, quite frankly, every other tenant in that building a lot of times. So that's the current legal landscape of how it's working.
Yeah, I bet. It's disheartening that lawmakers, particularly ours, are not seeing the long-term disadvantages, both to people that we want our economy to be growing. We want people to want to have affordable housing, to buy homes and be able to offer them, for a fair rent. All of these things make people say no thanks, including me, who has a fair amount of rentals who I'm trying to get out of because the risk is so high now of loss on my end that it doesn't make it worth it. Jennifer, if you would speak for a minute, I don't know if this is a fair question. You can tell me if it is or not, but if there's any changes in the last 6 months that would be worth talking about in landlord tenancy laws that have changed things for either side.
Certainly. The big one, of course, is rent control. The other one is heightened standards for service of notice. Rent control, for the most part, exceptions to every rule, but you have a rent cap now, which is 7% plus CPI or 10%, whichever is less. So 2025, maximum amount of rent you can raise is 10%. 2026, I believe it is 9.6% and a bit of change, but basically you need to make sure that when you are calculating the new rent, you are not going 1 cent over. There's extremely strong protections in place if you do not do so. It also increases the amount of notice requirements that now, for the most part, there's some tenancies are 30 days. For the most part, it is 90 days, or in certain jurisdictions, it can be up to 180 days. But you have to send out notices of a rent increase in advance using a form provided by the state of Washington. As well, you have to serve them in the same manner that you would serve all the notices of termination of tenancy. So the state of Washington believes that it is a good idea for people, property managers, landlords, to first show up with that notice of rent increase or notice of failure to comply, or notice of non-payment, knock on the door, say, oh my gosh, good tenant, here's your here's your rent increase notice, or here is something else, and actually hand it to them. Or if you cannot actually have somebody come to the door, you can post it, and then you have to send it through certified mailing. It is not enough anymore just to put a stamp on it and put it through the postal service. Certified mailing, which of course, every little thing is another administrative burden. It's another little layer where if you don't get that right, you risk having somebody come back years later and saying, I wasn't properly notified. You should not be able to increase my rent. Or for example, if the termination of tenancy wasn't served correctly, you have to start the case over. You didn't appropriately send it by certified mail as opposed to actually just putting a stamp on it. And so there's a lot more heightened requirements that are believed to be tenant protections. But quite frankly, let's take the certified mail. I don't think it is. Most tenants, and especially people who work, don't have the time or the ability to sign for certified mail. And so what you've now made is every property manager can no longer accept certified mailings on behalf of their tenants. Because let's say you are now accepting certified mailings and signing on behalf of them, your tenant isn't being served. So you're now telling property managers that they can't accept certified mailings on behalf of their tenants, which is a courtesy that most people in apartment buildings want. You are now saying that we need to increase the cost of every single notice, by having all of these resources that could be going to how are we going to increase amenities? How are we going to fix, if they now go to a heightened notice alone requirement as opposed to actually, making sure that other things are in place. So I actually don't think it helps tenants. I don't think it makes sense, but there's now a lot more regulatory hurdles that need to go on just to raise rent.
You kind of touched on it, but I want to just highlight something you said, and that's to say the goal is to have a relationship between the tenant and the landlord that's positive, right? There's open communication, there's a level of trust, there's good communication around any changes like rent increase. And when you add this, you're going to be served certified mail to talk about a rent increase with a tenant that you're having a great relationship with. There's this level of suspicion that automatically happens when we have to start behaving in this way. And I think it's incredibly short sighted. We used to be able to say, hey, it's the end of your term. Your rent is going up by whatever percent because the market has changed. And now that's not the case anymore. That's too bad. And also disheartening. Again,
It's even worse. Every time I try to tell people about some of these rules, a lot of people don't believe me. It used to be that you would be doing a good thing if you went in and had a handshake deal and said, oh my gosh, I understand you're behind on rent. Here, we're going to do this informal payment plan. We're going to help you out. And you'd be able to basically have some confidence that would be enforceable. Or your tenant would say, I can't afford it anymore. Can I have a check for $2,000? I have another place lined up. Please give me the check. I promise to move out. I promise I will. And you say, oh my gosh, I have worked with you. I trust you. Here's the check for $2,000. And the tenant doesn't leave. You have just harmed yourself because nowadays there's no such thing as an enforceable agreement without basically a commissioner's or a judge's signature on that agreement. There is case law that basically says that tenants have a right to a show cause hearing. So if you try to enter into any arrangement that terminates the tenancy, and basically says that we are going to discontinue our relationship without actually having the tenant have the ability to have a show cause hearing and without having, everything, commenced, it's non-enforceable because they cannot waive their right to the show cause hearing. So in reality, what that means is that unfortunately, there used to be a lot more, exactly what you're saying, a lot more help, a lot more, oh my gosh, you're behind on rent this month. We are going to wait 2 months. We're going to try this catch up arrangements. We're going to do all of these things. You can't do them anymore. Or if you do, just know that non-enforceable at all. Unless you actually file, commence litigation, file a complaint, and make sure that it is properly signed off on, there's no point in doing it anymore, which, again, so much of the advice I now have to give people, it is heartbreaking. I don't like the advice I have to give. I don't like telling people that they now have to operate in this way. The long-term relationships that people used to have, so much of the truly being able to have the relationships, help people out, understanding that people are going through tough times. There's no protection for people who try to go above and beyond. And even worse, if they do, it a lot of times can be arguments why the tenancy cannot be terminated because they would be homeless and now they can't find another situation as good as the place that you were providing. So you've actually harmed yourself.
Mhm.
So,
Oh, no more Mrs. Nice Lady or Mr. Nice Guy. Yeah, we're not focusing on relationship, which is ironic because I feel like the intent behind some of these laws originally was to say we're trying to be more human about this process. And this is the furthest thing from human. This is all about, did you sign this right? And was it served right? And I mean, it has gotten away from people caring about people for sure. I remember also, and I don't know if this is the same, that security deposits you can ask, but if the tenant says, I can't pay this upfront, that they have time to give you that full security deposit. So keep in mind, you find a new tenant, you're excited, yay. You sign a lease, everything's good. They're going to pay you the first month's rent. They do, but they give you just a portion of the security deposit because they can't come up with all of it right away. They move into your property and stop paying. So keep in mind, not only are you not getting rent, but now any financial recourse that you might have had from that security deposit that they were going to pay you no longer have, right? So likely they're going to leave the house in disarray. You have nothing from them outside of that percentage of security deposit that they gave you from the beginning. And you're sort of SOL in that regard.
so when I say this, I really do want to emphasize the majority of tenants are wonderful. The people in crisis, that is a smaller percentage, as well as I'll just call them professional tenants who, knowingly, intelligently, deliberately game the system. They're even smaller percentage. That being said, if you're gambling with your retirement funds, make sure that you're not losing your own house because yes, you can of course treat the failure to make the security deposit payments, all that you can treat that as a failure to pay rent, and you can commence litigation and provide a notice to pay rent or vacate. um, but on the other hand, you're still starting at square one. And so you are going to be going through months without ever having the full security deposit. In many cases, never even having 1 month of rent. You're now going to be writing checks for people who are living in your place because you cannot cut off utilities. You cannot engage in self help. And so a lot of times, what the tenants will say is, if you want me out, you're actually going to have to pay me. There's two schools of thought, and it goes down to people, their backgrounds, how they want to resolve it. Economically, a lot of times it is better to write a check and just end that relationship and end the drain on the resources. And again, I hate saying that, but economically, that is a lot of times a good solution. But in terms of any fundamental justice, in terms of anything that feels right, and especially because then that tenant is probably going to do the same thing to the next landlord. And after that, most of the mom and pop landlords I know who've had that happen to them once have pretty strong feelings about continuing in this industry. So, I mean,
Yeah, I love what you just said. And this podcast is easy to just continue to say all the hard and awful things that happen with becoming a landlord. And it's true that I've been landlording, if I'm going to make that a verb, for 15 years. And it wasn't until last year. And it was actually because I rented to a friend. So there's a little bit of advice for you about that. And that friend was the one who took advantage of me. So for 15 years with different rentals that I've had great tenants and people that paid. And when I needed to change tenancy, we were able to figure that out. To your point, I remember one time I wanted to sell a property and I said to the tenant, I know where we're at in our thing. If I give you X number of dollars, would you think that would help to find you a new place? And this was before we needed a judge or court order to sign that. And we signed a piece of paper. We notarized it even for whatever that's worth. And they followed through. And I wrote them a check for this, $3,000 or something. They found another place to live that helped cover some of their moving expenses, etc. And I was able to sell the property. So thankfully, there are people out there and the system can work to your advantage and also for everyone's advantage, tenant and landlord alike. But in the scenario that it doesn't, sort of being aware of what you're up against, because I was continually flabbergasted. I mean, just like, are you kidding me? Kind of was what I kept saying as I learned about all of these different rights that tenants have. Let's do just, if we can, a little summary. And first of all, thank you. Thank you for all the information. I've taken a bunch of notes, but also just, I like the spirit of which you come at this. And Anybody listening that has clients or they themselves are landlords and needs a great attorney, now you've got her information. You kind of know her shtick and where she comes from. And I appreciate your time on that. But take us, Jennifer, just through sort of a little summary to say, if you're going to do this, what are some ways to protect yourself on having this maybe go better than it possibly could?
Make sure you have money in the bank. And I'm so sorry to say it like this, but the days of buying a house, living in the garage, eating top ramen for a few years, so that you could actually build up your wealth, and it doesn't work anymore. If you're not able to afford the entire mortgage on your own, and if you're depending on that tenant, it is probably a bad idea. Make sure that you can approach this as a business investment. If this is, say, your mother's property that you inherited, you have strong emotionally ties to the home, please do not rent it. And I'm so sorry to say it like that, but if you are not willing to understand that bad things could happen to that property, you might not want to risk in that way. Make sure that you have your finances in order and you have, I guess I'll use the old school term, your Rolodex of people to call, and contact. And it should be somebody who does know how to issue proper notices. It should be somebody who can go through the ledger and really make sure that they are only including the proper amounts on that notice of failure to pay rent, because even a $10 error can restart the process. You really need to make sure that you are doing it for the correct reasons. That so many people I knew who used to be landlords really did it to try to help, different families and really develop that long term relationship. And I don't want to say it's impossible anymore, but there's a lot easier, safer ways to give back to the community now. And there's a lot safer ways to actually make those investments. And so, again, everything I'm saying is very heartbreaking for me because I truly believe in giving back. I truly believe
Yeah.
all the ways that we should be helping. But make sure that accounts are in order. Make sure you see the ledgers. Make sure that there's no secret agreements out there. Uh,
Yeah.
do all your due diligence and make sure that long term this is right for you. It still can be a good option in some situations, but every time just Google what's currently going on with the law of our low income housing and understand that there's a lot of people right now who are not wanting to continue this market because just the risks are so high. And so even if it's a small percentage of something going wrong, if things go wrong, there's extreme financial consequences that could occur.
Thank you. That's a great summary. I'll just add one thing to say, and I said this on the last time we did this podcast, and I think I have really benefited from having, speaking of your Rolodex, a good plumber, a good electrician, a landscaper, a cleaner, whatever it is that I know and trust, because property managers will usually find the person that's accessible or easy, not necessarily the most inexpensive or, so forth and so on. So if you are managing your own properties and you have good trusted folks to count on, use them. And then last bit of advice is to say, giving notice, and maybe I'll find out that I can't do this, so maybe I shouldn't say it, but giving notice to your tenant to say, I like to have the properties that I own professionally cleaned twice a year while you're in there. And so I'm going to give you notice, all the notice that you need per the law, but I am going to have my professional cleaner come in and clean the house. And that's to keep you from having sort of surprises at the end of the tenancy. It's also to get eyes in the house, to be honest, to get eyes in the house, to your cleaner can say, hey, they're now doing X, Y, and Z in the backyard. You thought, you should know that. And so it's a way to sort of protect your investment while also keeping tabs on what's going on in the house. So is that legal? Can I do that?
You can have a 48-hour notice of intent to inspect. You still have to be reasonable. You have to work with people, make sure that you find a time, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, people do have to allow you entrance to make sure that the property is in order. Again, you have to follow all the correct steps.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, I'm glad that you didn't say that, because it will become a dark day when they make a law that says, sorry, landlord, you can't enter your property anymore. I hope that never happens, but it feels like, boy, we're on a real slippery slope that's heading toward those places where we can't even see the house that we own, that we're on title for. So anyway, with that positive note, were you going to say anything,
Oh,
Jennifer?
and if somebody doesn't want to allow you access, this is the other heartbreaking caveat. You might actually at some point have to issue notices to comply or vacate. That people can be simultaneously calling the city and saying, look at all these problems that aren't being solved. while simultaneously denying you access. And so you need to make sure that you keep properly documenting that you are trying to do the right thing. You're trying to help, but they are not allowing you access. So again, inspecting the property, making sure things are up to code, things are going well, and making sure that you have the legal backing in case that people do not actually want to provide you the access to do the things you need to do.
Okay, Jennifer, as we wrap up, thanks again for being on the show, but just any last comments to finish this up?
So, anyone who's watching this podcast is clearly more interested and more in the know in the current trends than most people. And so, I really do want to encourage everyone who's listening to this to make sure that they are educating others. One of the major groups I'm seeing right now who really, it's so incredibly heartbreaking what's going on is members of our veteran community, people who have all the VA home loans in place, who have, that do it yourself. I'm going to get a duplex. I'm going to fix it up. I'm going to have this long term relationship. So they have the finances, they have the desire. They come back to the Northwest. They're going to buy property. Please make sure you educate people about what's going on because so many people feel truly blindsided, as well as, I'll use the word betrayed, when they realize all the roadblocks are in place. So if I have any final comments, it's I genuinely don't think people understand what's going on. I think there's so much well-intentioned legislation and people truly making rules from their heart and trying to do the right thing. And I don't think there's a lot of analysis or understanding about the detrimental long-term consequences. So please get out there, please talk to other people, and please actually, maybe we can help shift the pendulum back to something that's more balance related.
Oh, this has been so helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on the show. And I'm sure we'll be back in touch with you next year to see what else has come down the pike. So thanks again. Thank you so much for listening into Pocket Hours. I hope this has been interesting, fun, made you laugh, made you think, spurred you on to do and implement some new things in your business. I appreciate your time and hope this has been a good use of it, period. Now, go be the agent you would hire.